She was 7 months pregnant when he told her he didn't love her anymore. Not in private. Not in the quiet of their bedroom with the lights low and voices soft. He said it in the middle of a dinner party. His dinner party. In their home. With 12 of his closest colleagues sitting around the table they had picked out together on a Saturday afternoon 3 years earlier, when the world still felt like it belonged to both of them. She had just walked out of the kitchen carrying a dish. She had spent 2 hours preparing a belly round and full beneath the cream-colored dress she had ironed specifically for that evening. She was glowing the way pregnant women glow when they are loved and cared for, or at least when they believe they are. Her dark hair was pinned up, a few soft strands falling around her face, and she was smiling because someone had just said something funny, and she was the kind of woman who always laughed at the right moments. And then she heard him say it. She almost didn't catch the words because he said them quietly, almost casually, leaning toward the woman seated next to him. A woman named Vivian who worked in his company's marketing department and wore perfume so strong it reached the kitchen before she did, he said with a small laugh, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Honestly, I haven't been in love with my wife for a long time. The dish hit the table harder than she intended. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Some looked away instantly. Some didn't. His eyes met hers for just a fraction of a second. And in that fraction she saw something she had never seen from him before. Not guilt. Not shame. Not even the smallest flicker of regret. What she saw was annoyance. As if her hearing him was the inconvenient part. Her name was Maya Chen Harrington. And this is the story of what she did next. You have to understand who Maya was before you can understand what made this moment so devastating, and what made everything that came after so extraordinary. Maya had grown up in a modest house in a small city 3 hours from where she now lived. Her father was an electrical engineer who worked long hours and spoke few words, but every word he spoke mattered. Her mother had been a school teacher who believed fiercely, almost stubbornly, in the power of quiet intelligence. Maya had inherited something from each of them, her father's precision and her mother's patience, and she had built herself into something remarkable long before Daniel Harrington ever entered her life. She graduated at the top of her class, from one of the country's most competitive engineering programs. She turned down 2 job offers from companies most people spend their entire careers trying to get into. She chose instead a small but promising tech startup where she believed the real work was happening, where she believed she could build something that mattered. And for 3 years, she did exactly that. She was 26 when a senior vice president at a venture capital firm named Richard Callaway told her she had the most instinctive grasp of structural problem solving he had encountered in a decade of evaluating talent. She remembered every word of that sentence. She kept it, folded in the back of her mind like a note she planned to reference later. She met Daniel Harrington at a conference. He was 32, polished, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who entered rooms and immediately located the most important person in them. He had inherited a mid-sized technology company from his father and had spent 4 years aggressively expanding it. He had money, ambition, a fast smile, and the ability to make you feel, when he looked directly at you, that you were the only person in the world worth looking at. He looked at Maya that way at the conference. He found her at the cocktail hour, handed her a drink she hadn't asked for, and said, "You asked the only question this afternoon that actually mattered. I've been thinking about it for 20 minutes. She had asked about systemic inefficiencies in cloud architecture. Most of the people in that room had glazed over who had paid attention. They talked for 3 hours. He called the next morning. By the following spring, they were married. It was not the most romantic love story ever told, but it was real. At least it felt real to Maya. She loved him the way she loved everything she committed to completely. Quietly, with her whole self. She left her job at the startup because Daniel asked her to. He said it made more sense for her to focus on building their life together, that he had more than enough for both of them, that her talents could be applied to better things than 6 weeks at a company that wasn't even hers. She believed him. She believed in him. What she didn't yet understand was that Daniel Harrington had a very specific idea of what a wife was supposed to be. And brilliant, professionally ambitious, quietly powerful, none of those things were in his definition. The first 2 years of their marriage were not unhappy. They were simply lopsided. Daniel worked constantly. Maya managed everything else, the house, the social calendar, the dinners, the relationships with his colleagues and clients they're required. A hostess who was elegant and warm and never too opinionated. She did it all without complaint because she told herself it was temporary. She told herself that once the company stabilized, once Daniel got through this particular phase of expansion, things would balance out. He would see her again. He would remember who she was. What she didn't know was that while she was waiting for him to see her, he was already looking somewhere else. Her name was Vivienne Morale. She had joined Daniel's company 8 months into the marriage. She was beautiful in the sharp, deliberate way of someone who has always used beauty as a tool and has become very skilled with it. She was 20, ambitious, and completely uninterested in boundaries. Daniel was not her first married man. He would not be her last. But for a period of almost a year before Maya became pregnant, she was the primary reason Daniel stayed late at the office 4 nights a week. Maya found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday morning in October. She stood in their bathroom holding the test with both hands, her heart doing something complicated in her chest, part joy, part fear, part something she couldn't name. She had always wanted children. She had believed Daniel did too. They had talked about it, vaguely, the way couples talk about things they assume will happen naturally when the time is right. She told him that evening. Over dinner he put down his fork. He looked at her across the table for a long moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he smiled a careful, measured smile and said, "That's wonderful," and he picked up his fork again. In the months that followed, he came home later and later he traveled more frequently. He stopped asking how she was feeling. He stopped noticing when she redecorated the nursery, when she read parenting books late into the night, when she cried quietly in the kitchen because her back hurt, and she was alone, and none of this felt the way it was supposed to feel. He bought her things, expansive things, beautiful things, as though objects could substitute for presents, as though a cashmere blanket could replace a hand on her shoulder at 2 in the morning. When the baby kicked and she was wide awake and terrified, and full of love all at once. She tried to reach him. She tried many times. She suggested couples therapy. He said they didn't need it. She asked him directly, one night when he came home at midnight smelling of wine that wasn't from their cellar, whether something was wrong. He looked at her with that same flicker of annoyance she would come to know well and said, "You're being emotional. It's the hormones." She almost believed him, because it was easier, because the alternative, the truth, was something she wasn't ready to survive yet. The night of the dinner party, after the dishes were cleared and the guests had made their careful, awkward exits, Daniel stood in the kitchen and told her, calmly, as though reading from a document he had prepared in advance, that he wanted a divorce. Maya sat down on the kitchen stool. She placed both hands flat on the counter. She said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she said, "I'm 7 months pregnant," he said. "I know." She said, "Daniel," he said, "I'll give you whatever you need financially. I'm not trying to hurt you. I just can't keep doing this." She looked at him. This man she had loved. This man she had rebuilt her entire life around. Standing in their kitchen with his sleeves rolled up and his expression closed, like a door that has already been locked from the inside. She thought about every moment she had dismissed. Every late night she had forgiven. Every excuse she had accepted because she was afraid to look at what was underneath. And then she said the things she would later wish she hadn't said. The things she would spend 3 years quietly, privately regretting, not because she meant it, but because it made her sound small. And she was not small. She begged him. She begged him not to leave. Not now. Not while she was carrying his child. She told him she loved him, that they could fix this, that whatever had gone wrong between them they could find their way back to. Her voice broke. She cried. She pressed one hand against her stomach and asked him how he could look at her at this, at their child, and choose to walk away. He watched her cry with the patience of a man waiting for a presentation to end. And when she was finished, he said, simply, "I'll have my lawyer contact you tomorrow." He slept in the guest room that night. He was gone before she woke up. She gave birth to a girl 8 weeks later. She named her Lily Chun Harrington. She was born on a Wednesday afternoon with enormous dark eyes and the kind of cry that sounded more like an announcement than a complaint. Maya held her in the hospital room alone. Her mother had flown in the day before and was just outside the door. But for those first minutes it was just the two of them, and she made a promise to her daughter that she made with every part of herself, every cell and nerve ending and quiet, fierce corner of her heart. She said, "We are going to be fine," and then she said, "We are going to be more than fine." Daniel came to the hospital. He stood at the edge of the room, still in his work clothes, and looked at Lily with an expression Maya could not interpret. He held her for perhaps 2 minutes. He said she was beautiful. Then he left to take a phone call in the hallway and didn't come back. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Daniel's lawyers were efficient and expensive. Maya's lawyer was a woman named Helen Cross, who had been recommended by Maya's friend and former colleague Serena, and who turned out to be the kind of attorney who made opposing counsel visibly uncomfortable. The settlement was adequate, not generous. Daniel had made sure of that, and Maya had not fought for more than she needed. She was given the house, child support, and a lump sum. In return, she signed away any claim to his company or its assets. Everyone who knew Maya expected her to fall apart. Her mother worried. Serena called every other day. Even Helen, who had seen hundreds of women walk out of marriages in pieces, watched Maya carefully during their final meeting and asked, gently, whether she was okay. Maya looked at her and said, "I'm just getting started." Nobody quite understood what she meant. Not yet. Here is what nobody knew. What nobody had thought to look for. In the 2 years she had spent at home as Daniel's wife, Maya had not been idle. She had not spent her intelligence on dinner parties and interior decorating. She had been watching, listening, sitting across from her husband's colleagues at those carefully managed dinners, absorbing every conversation about market shifts and technology gaps and the particular vulnerabilities of mid-sized tech companies that were growing faster than their infrastructure could support. She had read everything. She had analyzed everything. She'd had, in the privacy of her home office while Daniel was traveling or working late, and been quietly constructing something. And she had a concept, a framework really, an elegant, almost brutally efficient solution to a structural problem in enterprise software architecture that she had first identified back at her startup and had spent 2 years refining in her head and on paper. She had never shown it to Daniel. She had tried once, in the early months of their marriage, spreading her notes across the dining table and explaining the core idea with the kind of excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. He had listened for about 4 minutes, then said something about it probably being too niche to scale, and changed the subject. She folded the notes back up. She kept working. After the divorce, with Lily sleeping in the next room in the house finally, completely hers, Maya started making calls. She called Serena, who had left the startup and was now working at a mid-level tech firm and who had always believed in Maya's mind. She called an old professor from her university who had connections she had never needed to use before. And she called Richard Calloway, the venture capitalist who had told her, 8 years ago, that she had the most instinctive grasp of structural problem-solving he had encountered in a decade. She remembered his words. As it turned out, he remembered. They met for coffee on a Thursday morning. Maya brought a 12-page executive summary and a working prototype. She had built over 6 months of late nights after Lily went to sleep. Richard Calloway read the first 4 pages without looking up. Then he closed the document, looked at her across the table and said, "How much do you need?" She told him. He said, "I'll double it." She named her company Meridian Solutions. What followed was not a straight line to success. Nothing real ever is. Maya spent the first year of Meridian burning through long days and short nights, managing a baby and a business simultaneously, making mistakes and correcting them and making new ones, learning things she hadn't known she didn't know. There were months where she questioned every decision she had made. There were nights where Lily woke at 2 in the morning and Maya sat nursing her in the dark, exhausted and uncertain, wondering whether she was brave or simply stubborn. But the technology worked. That was the thing. The core of what she had built was genuinely, undeniably good. And as the months passed and the small team she had assembled began to demonstrate what the system could do, the interest started to arrive, quietly at first, then steadily, then urgently. By the end of Meridian's first year, they had 3 clients. By the end of the second year, they had 19, including 2 Fortune 500 companies. The industry press started to notice. There were articles first in trade publications, then in wider tech outlets. One feature called Maya, the quiet architect of enterprise software's next evolution. She didn't read it more than once. She didn't have time. Daniel, meanwhile, was struggling. His company, Harrington Systems, had been expanding rapidly when the marriage ended. But the expansion had been aggressive in the way that sometimes looks like strength until it doesn't. He had overextended into markets he didn't fully understand, taken on debt he hadn't properly hedged, and made several high-profile hires that hadn't delivered. Vivian had been promoted to Chief Marketing Officer 8 months after the divorce, and was now, by multiple accounts, one of the key forces reshaping the company's public identity, which would have been fine, except that Vivian's strengths were aesthetic and social rather than strategic, and some of the rebranding decisions she championed had alienated long-term clients. Daniel was managing. Barely. He told himself that rough patch was temporary. He told his board the same thing. He hired consultants who presented impressive slides and built enormous fees and identified problems everyone already knew about without offering solutions anyone could actually implement. He did not think about Maya, or if he did not think about her professionally. He thought about her occasionally, in the way he might think about a chapter of his life that had ended with a vague, manageable guilt that was easy to set aside on busy mornings, which was every morning. He did not know about Meridian. Lily was 18 months old when Maya hired her first executive team. She was 2 years old when Meridian moved into real office space for the first time, an open-plan floor in a glass building downtown, with a view that made Maya stand at the window sometimes and simply breathe. She was 2.5 when Maya was invited to speak at the same industry conference where Maya had first met Daniel all those years ago. Maya stood at that podium in a deep navy blazer, her hair down this time, and she spoke for 35 minutes about the future of enterprise infrastructure. The room was full. People leaned forward. She didn't need notes. Serena sat in the front row and cried a little bit, which she would later deny absolutely. After the talk, several people approached Maya with business cards and proposals and introductions. One of them was a man named Thomas Whitfield, the senior acquisitions director for a private equity consortium called Vantage Capital Group. He shook her hand and told her he'd been following Meridian's growth for several months and that his group was very interested in discussing a significant partnership, not acquisition, he clarified quickly. Strategic alignment, the kind that could accelerate Meridian's expansion into European markets by 2 to 3 years. Maya said she'd have her office reach out to schedule a proper meeting. On the drive home from the conference, she called Serena. She said, I think it's starting. Serena said, it started a long time ago. You're just letting yourself see it now. The Vantage Capital meetings were productive. Maya liked Thomas Whitfield. He was direct, rigorous, and clearly respected the technical depth behind Meridian's platform. Over several weeks of negotiation, they built a framework that would allow Meridian to scale internationally without giving up the operational independence that Maya considered non-negotiable. It was during the third round of due diligence meetings that Thomas mentioned, almost in passing, a related matter his group had been evaluating. He said, "You may be aware that we've been looking at Harrington Systems as well." Maya kept her expression completely neutral. She was very good at this now. She said, "I've heard. They've been having some challenges." Thomas nodded carefully. "Their core technology has genuine value, but the company's structure has significant inefficiencies. And frankly, the leadership in recent years has been not optimal. We believe the right management could turn it around substantially. We've been in talks with the board, but it's a complicated situation because Harrington himself is resistant." Maya was quiet for a moment. She looked out the conference room window at the city below. Then she said, "Tell me more about the board structure." She did not move quickly. This was perhaps the most important thing about what Maya did next. The deliberateness of it. The patience. She had spent 3 years building something real, and she was not going to rush the final chapter for the satisfaction of speed. She spent 6 weeks studying Harrington Systems with the same precision she applied to everything. She reviewed their public filings, their client lists, the departures of key personnel, the patent portfolio, the debt structure. She had private conversations with 2 former Harrington employees whom she located through professional networks, both of whom were forthcoming about the internal culture under Daniel's current leadership. She consulted with Helen Cross, who was now as much a strategic advisor as a legal one. She had 3 more meetings with Thomas Whitfield, each one more specific than the last. And then, quietly, she had a conversation with Richard Calloway. She laid out what she was considering. She explained the strategic rationale, how Harrington Systems' client base complemented Meridian's expansion goals, how the absorption of their core technology assets could accelerate capabilities Meridian was planning to build independently. Anyway, how the timing was, frankly, almost too perfect. Richard listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Are you sure this is about strategy?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Is it also about something else?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's about both, and I've made peace with that." He leaned back in his chair. He said, "Then let's talk numbers." 3 years and 4 months after Daniel Harrington had stood in their kitchen and told her his lawyer would be in touch. 3 years after she had sat in the hospital room with her newborn daughter making a promise she intended to keep. Maya Chen sat at a long conference table on the 31st floor of a downtown office building. Across from her sat Daniel Harrington, his board of directors, and their collective legal team. He had not known she was coming. That had been very intentional. The initial rounds of acquisition talks had been handled through Vantage Capital as the primary buyer, with Meridian's involvement structured as a strategic co-investor. The documentation had been carefully layered. Maya's name did not appear in the opening communications, so when she walked into that conference room in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back, Lily's small drawing of a sunflower folded carefully in her inside pocket because she carried it always. Daniel's face did something extraordinary. It went through 4 visible stages in approximately 5 seconds. Recognition, confusion, understanding, and then something that was not quite shame and not quite fear, but was some combination of the two that lived in the place where arrogance meets reality. He said her name, just her name, Maya. She sat down. She opened the folder in front of her. She said, professionally and completely calmly, "Thank you for making time today, everyone. I'd like to begin with Section 3 of the term sheet, which outlines a proposed restructuring of the technology division." The board members looked between Maya and Daniel with the uncomfortable attention of people who have realized they are in the middle of something much larger than a business meeting. Daniel's lead attorney leaned toward him and whispered something. Daniel did not respond. He was still looking at Maya. She did not look back. She had prepared for this. She had known that seeing him in person would be a different thing than planning it from a distance. That there would be a moment where emotion threatened to surface, and she had decided in advance what to do with it. She gave it exactly 3 seconds. And then she put it away and opened to page 1. The meeting lasted for hours. Daniel attempted twice to derail the proceedings. Once by questioning Meridian's valuation methodology, which his own board's financial advisor subsequently confirmed was sound. And once by requesting an adjournment that 2 of his board members visibly disagreed with. His leverage was minimal. The board had been in quiet distress for months. 3 of the 7 members had already met privately with Thomas Whitfield. They understood what Vantage Capital and Meridian together represented. They understood that this deal was the difference between a controlled transition and an uncontrolled collapse. During the lunch break, Daniel found Maya alone in the hallway near the elevators. He looked different, not in the obvious ways. He was still well-dressed, still physically imposing, but something around his eyes had changed. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like the beginning of a reckoning. He said, "I didn't know you built this," she said. "I know." He said, "Maya, I need you to know that what happened, she said, quietly but with complete clarity. "Daniel, this is a business meeting." He stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. And then he said something she hadn't expected. He said, "You're extraordinary. You always were. I was just too small to see it." She held his gaze for a moment. She thought about the dinner party. She thought about the hospital room. She thought about 2 in the morning, sitting in the dark with Lily in her arms, wondering if she was brave or stubborn. Then she said, "Yes, you were." She walked back into the conference room. The deal was signed at 4:47. In the afternoon, Harrington Systems was formally acquired by a consortium led by Meridian Solutions and Vantage Capital Group. As the majority strategic partner, Meridian would assume operational control of Harrington's technology assets and absorb the majority of its engineering team. The Harrington Systems brand would be retired within 18 months. Daniel would receive a financial settlement and exit the company entirely when the documents were fully signed. And the attorneys were packing their briefcases, and the board members were making their way out in the quietly relieved way of people who've been waiting a long time for a difficult thing to be over. Maya sat for a moment in the now quiet conference room. Thomas Whitfield came and stood near her. He said, "How are you?" She said, "Tired and good." He nodded. He said, "What you built, Maya, do you understand how rare it is? Not just the company, the whole thing, what you did." She thought about her father, who had worked long hours and spoke few words, but meant every one of them. She thought about her mother, who had believed in the power of quiet intelligence. She thought about Richard Calloway handing her twice the funding she had asked for. She thought about Serena crying in the front row of a conference. She said, "I had a lot of help," he said. "Everyone does. Not everyone earns it the way you did." That evening, Maya drove home through the city in the golden light of a late afternoon that had held on past its expected time, the sky a warm blurred orange over the rooftops. She parked in front of the house, her house, the one she had been given in the divorce, the one she had turned from a place of grief into a home, and sat for a moment before going inside. Her mother was watching Lily. She could hear them, Through the front window, some kind of game involving a lot of giggling and the sound of things being stacked and knocked over. She sat with her hands loose in her lap, and let the quiet settle around her. She thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago, standing in that kitchen, crying, begging a man not to leave, because she didn't yet know what she was capable of. Without him, she didn't feel contempt for that woman. She felt, if anything, a deep and honest tenderness. That woman had been in pain. That woman had loved someone and lost him and had to figure out what came next with a baby growing inside her and no roadmap and no guarantee. That woman had done something remarkable. She had kept going. Maya reached into her inside pocket and pulled out Lily's drawing, a lopsided yellow sunflower on a square of paper with one petal notably larger than all the others because Lily had pressed too hard with the crayon and refused to start over. It's better this way, Lily had told. How seriously? The big one is the special one. She folded it back up. She got out of the car. She went inside. Lily ran at her from across the room, arms out, entirely committed. The way only small children run toward the people they love with no reservation and no self-consciousness and no thought at all for what happens if the person doesn't catch them, because they have never imagined the possibility of not being caught. Maya caught her. She always would. The news broke the following morning. The acquisition was covered in 3 major tech publications and to financial outlets within hours of the announcement. The headlines were, on balance, respectful and analytical, a story about market consolidation, about Meridian's ambitious expansion, about the strategic logic of the Vantage Capital partnership. But one journalist, a tech writer named Priya Osman, who had a gift for finding the human story inside the business story, published a piece that went considerably wider than the trade press. She had done her research. She had found the timeline. She wrote, with precision and without sensationalism, about the arc of Maya Chen's career, the early promise, the marriage, the years away from industry, the divorce, the founding of Meridian, and the particular symmetry of the acquisition's final structure. The headline was, The Quiet Architect, How Maya Chen Built the Company That Bought Her Ex-Husbands. It was shared 50,000 times in 24 hours. Maya's phone rang continuously for 3 days. Interview requests, congratulatory messages, partnership inquiries. She responded to the ones that mattered and let the others wait. She gave one interview to Priya Osman because the article had been fair and honest and because Maya respected the work. And in it she said relatively few things about Daniel and many things about the technology, about the team she had built, about what she was planning to do next. But at the very end of the interview, Priya asked her, "What would you say to the woman you were 3 years ago, standing in that kitchen just before everything changed?" Maya was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "I would tell her to stop trying so hard to hold on to the wrong thing, because what's waiting on the other side of losing it, what you're capable of building when you finally have space and time and necessity all lined up together, you can't imagine it from where you're standing. You just have to survive until you can see it." She paused. Then she said, "And I'd tell her to take better care of herself. Pregnancy is hard enough without trying to save a marriage that had already decided it was over." Priya laughed. Maya smiled, and for a moment it was just 2 women in a room, which is sometimes the best possible version of a story. 6 months after the acquisition, Meridian opened its first European office in Amsterdam. Maya flew there for the opening with Lily, who was by then 3.5 and had strong opinions about airplane snacks and the color of hotel bedspreads and whether the pigeons in the city square were friendly or merely strategic. Maya stood at the window of the Amsterdam office on the first morning, looking out over the canals, and felt something that she had not had the vocabulary for until recently. She had thought before that the feeling she was looking for was vindication, or triumph, or some version of "I told you so" delivered at volume to the universe. But standing there, with the morning light coming in off the water and the sound of her daughter demanding to know if they could visit the pigeons again, what she felt was simply, cleanly, undeniably free. Free in the way you can only be free when you have built something entirely your own. When you know, not because someone told you, not because a settlement or a headline confirmed it, but because you have done the work and watched it become real, that you are enough, that you were always enough, that the people who couldn't see it were not measuring accurately. Freedom, she had learned, does not arrive when someone apologizes. It does not arrive when justice is served, or when the deal is signed, or when the headline is written. It arrives quietly, personally, on an ordinary morning in a city you chose for yourself. When you realize that you are no longer defined by the worst things someone once made you feel. It was not the dramatic arrival she might have imagined. It was better. Daniel Harrington was not broken by what happened. That is the truth. And this story is interested in truth. He received his settlement, which was substantial. He moved to another city. He invested in several ventures over the following year with mixed results. There were reports, which Maya heard secondhand and did not seek out, that he and Vivian had ended their relationship shortly after the acquisition. Apparently the pressures of the business collapse had not been conducive to romance. He was seen occasionally at industry events, always well-dressed, always composed, never again quite as loud as he had once been. Maya did not track his movements. She was not interested in his suffering. She had been, once, in the raw months. After the divorce she would not pretend otherwise. Because dishonesty about your own darkness is just another kind of weakness. She had fantasized, yes, about precisely this kind of reversal. About him seeing, concretely and undeniably, what he had thrown away. About the look on his face. She had gotten that look. She had it in the conference room for approximately 5 seconds and it was fine. It was exactly what it was. It was a man understanding too late what he had failed to understand in time. It was not particularly satisfying in the way she had imagined. It was just real. What was satisfying genuinely, bone deep, satisfying was Meridian. Was Lily... Was Serena texting at midnight with all-cap celebrations? Was Richard Calloway saying, at the closing dinner, with quiet pride, I knew. That first meeting, I knew. What was satisfying was the morning, 6 weeks after the Amsterdam opening, when Maya sat down with her engineering team for the first planning session on Meridian's next product cycle. And 2 of the young engineers on the team, both women, one of them barely 24, looked at her the way she had, once, a long time ago, looked at the people she wanted to become. That was a thing worth building. That was the thing that lasted. There is a moment in every story where the narrator steps back and asks the question that the audience has been sitting with all along, the question underneath. All the drama and the betrayal and the triumph and the quiet mornings in Amsterdam, the question is this: was it worth it? Was it worth the pain? The humiliation in front of 12 dinner guests? The hospital room alone? The 6 months of a divorce that felt like surgery without anesthesia? The 2 in the morning moments with a crying baby and a crying mother and a company that was only an idea and might always only ever be an idea? Maya would tell you something important. She would tell you that framing it as worth it is the wrong frame. Because worth it implies a transaction. It implies that the pain was a price you paid for the reward. And that is not how life works. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a story that is cleaner than reality. The pain was not a price. The pain was a teacher. And the difference between those 2 things is everything. The dinner party didn't make her strong. She was already strong. The divorce didn't reveal her capability. It revealed it to her. Lily didn't give her something to fight for. She already had things worth fighting for. What all of it did, all the loss and the loneliness and the necessity, and the long and asked for months of starting over from nothing in a house that still held the ghost of a marriage she had believed in. What all of it did was remove the obstacles between Maya and the fullest version of herself. He thought he was ending her story. He was ending a chapter. And chapters, it turns out, are not story. Stories are much longer than any one person's decision about your value. 2 years after the acquisition, Meridian was shortlisted for a major industry award in the category of enterprise innovation. Maya attended the ceremony with Serena, Richard and 3 members of the founding team who had been there since the beginning. Lily was at home with her grandmother, with strict instructions to be asleep by 8 and a secret agreement between grandmother and granddaughter that they would watch one more episode of their show if they could do so without getting caught. Maya did not win the award. A larger company with a more established track record took the prize, which was entirely fair and which Maya had more or less predicted. She applauded when they won. She shook hands during the networking hour. She stood in the ballroom in a dress the color of midnight with her hair down and her posture easy and her eyes clear, and she was entirely present in the room, which is something many people in that room could not say. At one point during the evening, she found herself standing near a woman she didn't know, mid-sturdy's nervous energy, a glass of water instead of wine. The particular quality of presence that says, I am here because I need to be, not because I want to be. Maya recognized something in her, not the circumstances, but the texture of them. She introduced herself. The woman said her name was Claire. She said she worked in product development at a company she clearly found frustrating. She said she had a project she had been developing on the side for 2 years that she hadn't shown anyone, yet because she was afraid it wasn't good enough. Maya looked at her for a moment. She said, "Show it to someone. The right someone. Don't wait until you're sure it's perfect, because perfect is how good ideas die." Claire looked at her with an expression that cycled through several things quickly. Then she said, "How did you know to do that? How did you know to keep going when everything was falling apart?" Maya considered the question. She thought about her father's precision and her mother's patience. She thought about 12-page executive summaries and late nights and Lily's lopsided sunflower in a conference room on the 31st floor of a downtown building where she had walked in and changed the ending of her own story. She said, "I didn't know. I just decided that if it was going to fall apart anyway, I would fall apart building something rather than fall apart doing nothing." She handed Claire her card. She said, "When you're ready, send it to me." 2 months later, Claire sent it. It was good. Not perfect, nothing ever is at the start, but it was good the way Meridian had been good at the beginning. Structurally sound, genuinely original, and built by someone who had clearly thought about it. For a long time in the quiet hours when nobody was watching, Maya forwarded it to Richard Calloway with a note that said, "You're going to want to read this one, because here is the last thing this story is about. It is not only about a woman who survived a betrayal and rebuilt herself into something formidable. It is not only about justice, or karma, or the satisfying symmetry of watching an arrogant man discover too late what he threw away. Those things are in the story, they're real parts of it. But the story is really about this. What becomes possible when a woman stops organizing her life around someone else's limitations, when she stops making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of what she should be, when she stops measuring her value through someone else's willingness to see it, when she takes all that intelligence and patience and discipline and fierce, bottomless love, love for her child, love for her work, love for the version of herself she has not yet become, and she points it in the direction of the only life she was ever supposed to be living." Daniel Harrington thought. He was leaving a wife. He left an empire, he just didn't know it yet. And she, Maya Chen Harrington, who removed the Harrington eventually, and then kept the Chen and added the Meridian, and built a life that had no room for small definitions of worthy women. She knew. She had known, in some quiet corner of herself, since before he ever shook her hand at a conference and handed her a drink. She hadn't asked for, she had always known what she was worth. She had simply been waiting, in that patient and precise way her father's daughter always had, for the right conditions to prove it. The world, when it finally paid attention, agreed with her completely. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, listening to this, and there is something in this story that landed close to where you live, some recognition in the dinner party, or the hospital room, or the long nights building something with shaking hands while a small person sleeps in the next room, then this last part is for you. You do not need anyone to leave before you can begin. But if they already have, if you are already standing in the kitchen, or already signing the papers, or already somewhere in the long middle of starting over, with less than you expected and more than you realize, then hear this.